148 verses. It's quite long, and this is an overview of Parshas Vayetzei. It's on page 145 in the Art Scroll. It begins in the middle of a chapter 28, verse 10. As I say, this is basically an overview of the Parsha. The portion takes off in the story that, hello, Ryan, nice to see you.
Hello.
With us. So the portion tells us, starts in the middle of a story. And that is that after Yaakov had received the blessings from Yitzchok, and Eisav came in and discovered it, he says, Vayistoim, he was fuming angry, and he wanted to kill Yaakov. We see here the respect they say for his father, that he actually didn't kill him. But Rivka was worried that it might take place, so she came to Yitzchok and says, Katzti b'chayai, it will mamish disgust me if I see Yaakov marrying a daughter of Canaan. We know that Avram did not want that for Yitzchok, and so send him away to my brother Lavan, who has two daughters, and let him make a shidduch there. And that's where the story picks up from. And the portion starts off, VAYEITZEI Yaacov mi Beer Sheva vayelech Chorono, that Yaakov left Beer Sheva and he went to Choron. Now, just before in last week's portion, we know that they lived in Beer Sheva, and there already it told us that he left Beer Sheva. So why does the Torah repeat it? All it has to do is say Vayelech Chorono, is what Rashi asks. All you have to do is say he went to Choron. And Rashi answers that the Torah is stressing he left. Why is he stressing that he left, even though we know that already? Because he wants to say that when a tzaddik is in a city, there's a certain influence of the tzaddik that is felt. And Vayetzei, when the tzaddik leaves Yitzias HaTzaddik Oyser Roishom, it makes an impression, because then Pana Haida, Pana Ziva, Pana Hadora, and all its glory and its beauty leaves. Now, the Rebbe has a few things to say about that, including the fact that there were still two tzaddikim there, Yitzchok and Rivka. So why should it have such a big influence? And the Rebbe answers, one answer he gives is that Yitzchok sadly had become hard of seeing, and Rivka was busy taking care of him, so the influence, the impression that Yaakov had on the city was much stronger. The Rebbe also adds that VAYEITZEI Yaacov mi Beer Sheva, leaving Beer Sheva, is actually also teaching us about the neshama, about the soul. Beer Sheva, he says, is the source of the soul above. Be'er refers to a well. A well is a source, so that's the source of the soul. And it says, Vayelech Chorono, he went to Choron. We know not Corona, but Chorono. And Chorona is the anger of the world. And it is, the soul is taking a risk and sacrificing itself by coming down to a physical world where there'll be so many temptations and so many things drawing him away from God, says the Rebbe. But why does VAYEITZEI Yaacov, why does the soul come down into the body? And it is Yerida Tzoyrech Aliyah. It is only through this descent that the soul can elevate itself and go that much higher in the spiritual worlds. And it's going into Choron that there is all the Choron is where all the hiding of godliness takes place and all the temptations. And the aspect of the leaving of the soul from its cleaving to God, Eisher Rachel makes an impression. What does it mean? It makes an impression is that when he goes there, he takes with it the sacrifice, the great cleaving to godliness. And once he leaves Beer Sheva, it says in the Torah, Vayifka b'mokim. He met the place. And Rashi says that that refers to the evening prayer that Avraham Yaakov made, as we know. Avraham. Just a sec. Avraham made Shachris, Yitzchok Mincha, and Maidav was introduced by Yaakov. And Maidav is night, darkness. Yaakov would be the patriarch that would go through the most challenges, as we see from here till the end of the book of Bereshis is a story of Yaakov and his children. Now, there is a great fear of the unknown. You often speak to people and they may define the fear of death. I think that is connected mainly with the fear of the unknown. Yaakov is going into total foreign territory. As the Rebbe says, he was a ish tam yoshev oyalim. Till now, he was a person who was totally involved with Torah, mitzvahs, sitting a yeshiva, and as Rashi tells us in last week's portion, he spent 14 years. He was 63 years old when he left his parents' home, and he spent 14 years in the yeshiva of Noah's son and great-grandson, Shem and Ava. So by now, when he is leaving, coming to Choron, he is 77 years old, and he knows that the future is frightening. And it says he goes to sleep. Rashi tells us that there was a great miracle, and the Mount Moriah, the Har HaMoriah on which the Beis Hamikdash would be built, and the mount on which Avraham brought Yitzchok as a sacrifice, came there and went underneath him, and there he fell asleep and he had a dream. The Torah first tells us he took the stones of the place. How many stones did he take? The 12 stones, because those would be a sign of the 12 tribes, and they would all become one. And he has what is a very, very famous dream. In his dream, he sees a ladder with the bottom on earth and going up to the heavens. And on top of the ladder, it says, is Hashem is there on top of the ladder. And Hashem promises him not to worry. I will protect you wherever you go. And he also promises him the very famous verse that Zaracha, your seed will be, your children will be like the dust of the earth. Ufaratzta yama v'kedma v'tzafayna v'negba. You will spread west, east, north, and south. V'nivrechu v'chol kol mishpachos ha'adamo v'zarecha. And the families of the world will bless in you. This verse, by the way, the Rebbe instituted that they say in Chabad shuls at the Hakofis, at the end of Atar Reisa, and as we know, Uforatzta, to spread forth. It's a very famous Chabad song. That was the motto of the Rebbe for many, many years. And he said, don't worry, I will always protect you, and I will never, ever abandon you. Now, there's a very interesting lesson here, because one very often thinks that if Hashem is protecting us, that means everything in our life is going to go smooth and that we're never going to have any problems again. But we see from Yaakov that that is not so. He had continuous challenges wherever he went. So God, our protection is not that God will wipe away all challenges. There are reasons why we have to go through the challenges that we have to go through. It is rather that at the end of the day, Hashem will look after us and we will survive it all, as is the history of the Jewish people. Now, in the dream, it says that the angels, Oilim v'Yardim boy, were going up and coming down. So Rashi asks, angels' residence is in heaven. So it should have first said they were coming down, and they were coming down and going up, not going up and coming down. And there are different answers given, but amongst the answers is that we like to say up first. Rashi's answer is that there were different angels. There's the angels that protect us in Israel, the holy place, and there is the angels that protect us outside of Israel. So therefore, Yaakov was about to leave Israel. So there were angels following him now, the angels of Israel. So therefore, they were down on earth following and protecting Yaakov. They first went up. And the angels of Chutz La'aretz, of the diaspora, were coming down to protect them. Now, the question is that we know the angels have to obey the Torah. And there's a law that you're not allowed to leave Israel except under certain conditions. So the Rebbe asks, how could they leave Israel? And I'm sorry, that's not the Rebbe's question. The Rebbe's question is that they were allowed to leave Israel because it was only the patriarchs kept it, but not the rest. It wasn't commanded. So the question is, why couldn't the angels of Israel actually escort him outside of Israel? And he answers that in the time of the patriarchs, Israel physically was not yet a holy place. It was only spiritually, on a level of potential, that it would become a holy place, and on a spiritual level, it was a holy place. And therefore, the angels, being in the spiritual world, they couldn't go with. When Yaakov wakes up from that dream, he is full of hope, and he makes a promise. And his promise is that as if Hashem is with me, then I will tithe everything. I want to tell you two cute stories about this whole situation. One is there was a very famous Rebbe by the name of Rabbi Yisrael Rizhiner, and he, as a 5-year-old, was a genius, to the extent that when his teacher taught him Chumash and Rashi, the Rishner, based on the verse of Chumash, would immediately ask Rashi's question, and his teacher would give him Rashi's answer. But here it says that the angels, Eilim, were going up the Yardim and coming down. And Rashi asks, angels live in heaven. Why does it say first they were going up? So that's a question. And the Rishner did not ask that question. This was the first time since Bereshis. So the teacher turns to the Rishner and he says, Rabbi Yisrolik, my son, my boy, don't you have a question here? He says, no. So yeah, it says Rashi's question. Why don't you ask why the angels went up? And the Rishner said, but this is a dream. In a dream, anything that doesn't make sense is possible. Why would I be asking such a question? That's one of the famous stories there. And the other story here is that Yaakov makes a promise. He says that if God protects me, v'nosan li lechem lechol, he gives me bread to eat, to veged lilbosh, and clothing to wear. And then he concludes, v'shafti b'shalom el beisavi, I will return in peace to my father's house. V'hoya Hashem li lelokim, and God will be my God. The story is told, I think it is with the Alter Rebbe, that he once gave a blessing. And what is the Jewish blessing? That God should bless you begashmis uberuchnius. Begashmis uberuchnius means physically and spiritually. So one person took exception to it. And he said, if you're going to give me a blessing, don't you think you should say physical before spiritual? So give me a blessing that God should bless me spiritually and physically. And the Rebbe answered that when you look at the blessing here of Yaakov, what does he say? God will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear. That's physical. And then only does he conclude, Voya Hashem li lelokim, God will be my God. That's a spiritual. So you see that Yaakov felt the correct sequence is physical before spiritual. So they answered the Rebbe, how could you compare Jacob's physical to ours? His physical is like our spiritual. To which the Rebbe answered, how could you compare Jacob's spiritual to his physical? It's not comparing us to him. It's in comparison to himself that he said first physical and then spiritual. And we see, as the Alter Rebbe told us, that the greatest blessing is that God should bless us with physical, and then we should take the physicality and transform it into spiritual, which is what Yaakov had to do, as we discussed, the soul coming down into the world with all its challenges. So to Yaakov would have to go into exile with all its challenges, and it is in this portion that he'll have 11 of the 12 sons of his, which will enable him and help him to uplift the whole world. And talking about this portion, you know, if you look at the Torah, we've discussed this many times, we call a parsha either the whole weekly portion, but a parsha is also like a chapter in the Torah. And there's different types of chapters. There's a patuach and a satum. There is an open chapter where there's a length of the Torah and the line is open. And there is a satum where the line is closed. Most sedras in the Torah have many portions. VAYEITZEI is unique. VAYEITZEI is only one closed parsha. The whole parsha, you could look at it. In the 148 verses, you don't have one break in the Torah. No empty lines. And that is because Yaakov is in exile through this parsha, and so his mind is always on Israel. So he doesn't think about anything else. But he is given a totally new inspiration and a totally new vigor in life. And there it says, the next pasuk, Vayetzei Yaakov es raglov, Yaakov lifted up his feet and he went to the land of the east. Now, Rashi asks, we don't ever find the expression of Vayetzei Yaakov raglov, that someone should lift up his feet. What does that mean? So I want to tell you a story that I've told this year many times in the past. My father of blessed memory used to often drive us to school or wherever we went. My father would never let us drive with him unless we said a Dvar Torah. You got into the car, you had to say a Dvar Torah. My father told us always, it is more the Dvar Torah that makes the car go than the petrol. And we always had to struggle to think, what can we tell him? Until my brother Yosef one day came home from school and he told my father this Rashi that we're talking about now. Vayetzei Yaakov raglov. Yaakov picked up his feet. And Rashi says, what does that expression mean? Says Rashi, Mishohuftach b'shmira, when he was promised to be protected. Noso liboy es raglov, his heart just lifted up his feet. V'naso kal leches, and it became easy for him to walk. Kach mefurish beBreishis Rabbah. That is how it explains it in Breishis Rabbah. So my brother said that Rashi to him. It's a short, easy Rashi, and that was the Rashi from then on that all of us would tell my father. And that was the case even after we got married. If my father would pick us up from the airport or the bus station or wherever we went with him, he always made us say a Dvar Torah, and that was the Dvar Torah. The conclusion of that story is that sadly, in 1985, when my father was 72, he had a bad heart attack and he was in the hospital. He would never recover from that bed. One of my brothers sat with him and said that Rashi, Mishuhuftach b'shmira, God promised us protection. Nosaliboy es raglov, her heart lifted up, his heart lifted up his feet. V'nasokala leches, and it became easy to walk. And my father smiled. That was one of the last things that my father heard in this world. And we then read that he comes to the well, as mentioned by Eliezer. For many reasons, the well seems to be a popular place, but Yaakov would have to go through things that none of the other patriarchs would have to go to. Yitzchok found it easy. It was Eliezer who did all the hard work for him. And he knew that he was going to find Lavan, and Lavan had two daughters, Leah and Rachel. Leah is the older one, Rachel is the younger one. The people used to say, and it seems like Yaakov felt that way originally too, that Rivka has two sons, Yaakov and Eisav. Lavan has two daughters, Rachel and Leah. So Rachel will go, the younger one will go to Yaakov, and the older one will go to Eisav. And that's why in the description, it says a much greater description about Rachel. And that's why we find that when he comes to the well, he asks them, where are you? And they say, we are We are in Haran. He says, you know, Lavan ben Nachar, and they answer yes. And Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep. And Yaakov, so to say, tells them off. And he says, Hezekiah, why are you hanging around? Why don't you give your water, the sheep to drink? And they answer, there's a whole spiritual lesson here that there's a big rock, and we all have to gather together to remove the rock from the well. Yaakov was an extremely strong man, and he goes and moves the rock by himself. Rashi says in a very easy way. And Yaakov sees Rachel and he becomes extremely emotional. And we read a very strange story. This is the only time in Torah that you have a story in verse 11, Vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel. And Yaakov kissed Rachel and he cried. Rashi says he cried because he saw by a divine inspiration that he will never be buried with Rachel. She'll be buried in Kever Rachel, and he will be buried in Ma'aras HaMachpelah. But the question is, where in Torah do you find, besides a parent and a child, that an unmarried person should kiss a girl? And I heard from Shlomo Carlebach, my cousin, a very beautiful explanation. Do you know, in Shir HaShirim, it says where King Solomon writes the description of the relationship between God and the Jewish people, it says, Yashikenu Menashikas Pihu, that God will kiss me with a kiss on my mouth. And the Kabbalists and all the people whom the Mefarshe of Tanakh, they explain that refers to the giving of the Torah. What is that all about? Whenever you are transmitting things spiritually with the greatest depth, that means when you're giving over your greatest depth, the way it is described, because we have no description of spiritual terms, it is described as a kiss, when you're giving the greatest secrets and the greatest blessings. And he says, that is why you'll notice a natural thing. It's very interesting, he points out. When his daughters were very young, it's an instinctive thing of children that when they kiss a parent, they close their eyes. Look at it next time. Why do they close their eyes when they're giving a kiss? Whoever told them to? They do it instinctively without even being told. And one reason is this very thing, that you're giving over the deepest secrets. Yaakov had received the blessings from Yitzchok. Those are the blessings he wanted to transmit to the person who will become the mother he was hoping of the patriarchs. He at that time was planning to marry Rachel. So that is a physical description of a spiritual action of giving over those blessings. Rashi gives another reason why he cried. He was very embarrassed because when Eliezer came to get Rivka, he had fortunes, he had the document of all Avram's wealth. He had a lot of wealth with him, and he gave beautiful presents to Rivka. And here was Yaakov, and he had nothing. Rashi explains, why did he have nothing? He left with a lot of wealth. But Eisav was so angry at Yaakov that he sent his son Eliphaz to kill Yaakov. And when he caught up with Yaakov, he said, I have to kill you. That's the mitzvah my father gave me. So Yaakov showed him that it says, Oni choshev kemes, that a destitute person is considered like dead. So take all my possessions, and then I'll be destitute, and in that way you'll have fulfilled the command that your father gave him, and he agreed. Now, Rivka ran to tell her father, and then we read that he came towards him, Vayoratz Lokroso, he ran towards him, Vayichabek loy, he hugged him, Vayinashek loy, and he kissed him, and he brought him to his house. So Rashi says, when he ran towards him, if you remember, Lavan had ran towards Eliezer, hoping to get some of that wealth. He didn't get it then. And here, he was hoping to get wealth. He didn't see anything. Vayichabek loy, so he kissed him, he hugged him, hoping to feel his pockets and thinking maybe it was in gold. But it wasn't there. Vayinashek loy, so he kissed him thinking maybe he was keeping diamonds in his mouth. But when he saw that nothing, Yaakov came with nothing, he said, you can stay with me for a month. He never paid him. He made him work for that month. And then he said, what can I pay you to work for me? Now, it says in the Torah that Lavan had two daughters. Shem HaGedolah was Leah, Veshem HaKtana Rachel. The bigger one was Leah, the older one, and the Ktana was Rachel. The Rebbe's father asks Kabbalistically as well, why does it say Hagdoila v'Aktana? That generally means not the older one or the younger one. That you'd say Bechira and Seira. Why does it say Hagdoila and Haktana? One answer they give, it's a whole Kabbalistic aspect, that the Yud Kei Vav Kei, the name of God, is two letters. There's the higher Hey and the lower Hey, that they go into a whole length. But some commentaries say that this is actually going back to Eisav being the older one and Yaakov being the younger one. And here, in a way, Yaakov got back what he gave, because he asks for the hand of Rachel, Haktana, the younger one, the younger one. He says, I want to marry Rachel, your younger daughter, Bitcha Haktana. And the Lavan says, I'd rather give it to you than to anybody else. And he works 7 years for it. And then it says that evening he gave Leah instead, as we'll discuss in a moment. And when Yaakov says, why did you fool me? Listen to what he says. Lavan says, Lord, it's not done in our place. To give the younger one before the older one. This is a similar expression as Eisav the Bechar and Yaakov the Katan that happened with Yitzchok and the way they fooled him. Now, Yaakov worked for 7 years for Rachel. And they all knew that Lavan was a swindler. So the Rebbe points out that Rachel and Leah basically looked the same, they sounded the same, and it was very easy to mistake them. So because Yaakov knew that he might be mistaken, and he knew at the wedding Leah would be completely veiled, and then when they are intimate together, there'll be total darkness, and maybe Leah wouldn't speak. So he gave Rachel certain signs that he knows that it's Rachel. According to some, the signs were the 3 mitzvahs that a woman has: the mitzvah of kosher, Shabbos and candles, and family purity. When Lavan decided to marry Leah off to Yaakov, for whatever reason, Leah was going to the chuppah, and Rachel knew that if she doesn't give Leah the signs, Leah will become terribly embarrassed. Now, Rachel did not know that Yaakov would marry both of them. As far as she was concerned, at the time that she would give Leah the signs, it was total self-sacrifice. She was ready to be married to Eisav, God forbid, but she was ready to do that just so that her sister would not become embarrassed. Later, she would be rewarded. All the blessings that Yosef would get comes as a result of this sacrifice that Rachel did. So she gave the signs to Leah, and Yaakov obviously was not aware of anything. And that night he was intimate with Leah. And from there, the Kabbalists say Reuven was born. And as Miller writes in his Chumash, that Reuven's soul suffered from a spiritual blemish because Yaakov was inevitably thinking about Rachel during this union and not Leah. It was this imperfection that possibly led Reuven to err with Bilhah, which is a whole different discussion. But we see the divine justice when, as a result of Reuven's sin, Joseph was awarded the double inheritance rights of the firstborn in Reuven's place, because Jacob's intention was thus fulfilled to have a firstborn with Rachel. Quite a powerful line. And Yaakov is fuming at Lavan. Can you imagine? And he says, Lama rimisani, why did you swindle me? And Lavan says, that is the way it is. We don't allow the younger one to marry before the older one. If you want Rachel, I'm ready to give her to you. And all you have to do is work for another 7 days. Now, 7 years. But I want to point out that although he had to work for another 7 years, he didn't wait 7 years to marry Rachel. Male Shavua Zois means that he waited 7 days, 1 week, for the Sheva brachas to be over, and he married Rachel 7 days after Leah. And here we learn that you shouldn't make the Marvin Simcha B'Simcha. You don't mix one wedding with another. And if 2 sisters are getting married the same day, if not, I'm not mistaken, I remember Rabbi Bernhard had 2 daughters married the same day. They made 2 different chuppahs, one before nightfall and the other after nightfall, so that it was 2 different weddings. And he worked for another 7 years, and to show how full of integrity Yaakov was, even though he was ripped off, because he originally worked 7 years for Rachel and was given Leah. When it came to the second 7 years, even though he had already had Rachel as a wife, he worked very full of integrity. Now, there's a whole discussion as to why, if the patriarchs kept the mitzvahs before they were given, we know there's a law that you're not allowed to marry two sisters. How could Yaakov marry these two sisters, Yaakov and Eisav? And one of the reasons given is that they only kept the mitzvahs in Israel. But the fact is that Rashi brings that Vayishlach Yaakov, when Yaakov sends messengers to Eisav next week's Parsha, it says, Im Lavan Garti, I lived with Lavan, Taryag mitzvah Shamarti, I kept the 613 mitzvahs. So the Rebbe points out there are commentaries that say Yaakov didn't keep the mitzvahs outside Israel, but that's not Rashi's opinion, because Rashi says that he did keep them. And one of the answers given is that the nations had taken upon themselves not to swindle one another. And if there was a law that they had taken upon themselves, that took precedence over the 613 mitzvahs that the Jews would give later. So since he promised Rachel that he would marry her, he didn't want to swindle her by only marrying Leah, so therefore that took precedence and he had to marry. That's one answer that the Rebbe gives. Another answer that the Rebbe gives is that the reason you cannot marry two sisters is because you are causing those people who naturally have love for one another to become jealous of one another and to hate one another, and winning the passion of their husband. But we see that Rachel was ready to give up everything for her sister Leah to get married, and so they were able to get married. We then read how Hashem sees that Rachel is the more beloved one, and she opens up the womb of Leah, and Rachel is sterile. What does it mean, says the Rebbe, that he had to open up the womb of Leah? That teaches you they were so similar, even in the fact that both couldn't have children. But Hashem wanted to give Leah that special love, and she had a son. And she says, Reuven means to see. God saw my pain. Now my husband will love me. I see it's getting late. So there's a lot of explanations on all these things from the Rebbe, but I'm just going to give the overview more or less of the rest. And the second son she calls Shimon. Shimon comes from the word Shema Yisrael, Shema here, and Hashem heard that I was hated, and he gave me the son Shimon. She had a third son, and she said, my husband will cleave to me. Why did she say that? Rashi points out that the matriarchs had divine inspiration, and they saw through Ruach HaKodesh there'll be 12 sons to Jacob, and there would be 4 wives, Rachel and Leah, and then, as you'll see in the portion, Bilhah and Zilpah as concubines. So if there's 4 wives and 12, each matriarch should have, by right, 3 children. So she said, this third one will cause my husband to cleave to me, become more attached, and she called him Levi. And then she had another son, and she said, this time I thank God. And she called him Yehuda. The Jews, the word Jew comes from the word Yehuda, from Judah. And that is what our nation is called, even though the Jewish people come from all 12 tribes. Why are we called the name Judah? This is because of the reason he was called. You can ask, why did Leah wait till the fourth son to call him thank you? Why didn't she say thank you to God with the first son? But as I just said, she knew she should have three children. And when she had a fourth one, she said, this time I got more than I deserve. And when you get more than you deserve, you owe your benefactor a special thank you. And the Jewish people live by this. When they serve God, when God gives them blessings, they're always saying that God has given me more than I deserve, and that's why we are called Judah. Now, Rachel comes to Yaakov and says, give me children, and if not, I'm as good as dead. And Yaakov becomes upset with Rachel and says, was willst du von mir? Am I the one that's preventing you from having children? And this is in itself a very big question. How does, as he puts it, why is infertility so devastating? How many parents feel that their total value is in their children? And does infertility strain or deepen a person's relationship with God? And how can an infertile person avoid guilt, blame, depression, and hopelessness? So Rachel says that basically the one who brings up a child is like the mother, and you have my maidservant Bilhah, and I will bring up those two children. And so she gives the maidservant, and Bilhah has these two children, Dan and Naphtali. And Leah, see, she was all about having children. She saw that after the four she didn't have anymore, she gave Zilpah to Yaakov, and Zilpah had Gad and Asher. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Those would be from the two concubines. So Leah now has four sons, and Bilhah and Zilpah have four each. That is a total of 8. We then read that Reuven goes out and collects these dudaim, mandrakes. According to some, they were some type of aphrodisiac or whatever it's called, and helps you have children. And Rachel sees those dudaim and she wants them. And she asks Leah for them, and Leah gets all upset. You took my husband, which is a bit of sarcasm there. And now you want to take my flowers, but I want children so much. I'll tell you what. You can have my flowers if you give Yaakov to me for this night. Obviously, there are so many Kabbalistic secrets hidden in this whole story. It's not, for now, unfortunately, but it's not an easy story to understand. But the bottom line is, when Yaakov comes home that night, Leah goes to meet him and says, you are mine. And what she wanted so much was children. She said, Sochar scharticha, that I have paid a fee, so to say, a reward. And she has the fifth son, whom she calls Yisachar, from the word reward. And then Hashem gives her a sixth son. And he says, Hapam Zvodani Elokim Oisi, God has given me a good portion, that I have 6 sons, and she calls him Zvulun. And then the Torah said she fell pregnant again. And this time she had a daughter whom she called Dinah. Dinah comes from the word din, which means judgment. And according to Rashi, what was the judgment? She said, look, Yaakov is going to have 12 sons. I have 6, Bilah and Zilpah have 2 each. That's a total of 10. If I now give birth to a 7th son, then Rachel will only have 1 son left. That'll be less even than Bilah and Zilpah. I can't do that to her. And she prays to God. And according to the Kabbalists, the first 40 days of pregnancy, somehow the gender of the child can be changed. And so although he was supposed to be a boy, it was changed to a girl. And that's why later we will find that Joseph will have, so to say, certain feminine qualities to his soul with his combing the hair, and Dinah will have certain male qualities to her soul, where she goes out with that whole story of Shem. And finally, Hashem remembers Rachel, and he gives her a child. And she says that God now has Osaf Escharposi, has concealed my disgrace. And she calls him Yosef. Yosef means additional. They knew there would be another son. She said, may the next son be from me. Now we know that Yosef was a great power, as we are told in the Haftarah as well, and Rashi brings it, that Yaakov is the spark, Yosef is the fire, and once Yosef is born, Yaakov feels confident to confront Eisav. So he comes to Lavan after working for him for 14 years, and he says, the time has come to leave. I now have Yosef born to me. And Lavan knows that his whole success and all his blessing comes from the fact that Yaakov works for him. Before Yaakov came to him, he was a pauper. He had his daughter being a shepherd. Now he's a multimillionaire and the leader of the community. He doesn't want to see that all disappear. So he says, no, don't go. I'll tell you what, you name your price and you will work for me. And again, you need to have the understanding of the Kabbalistic writings here. Yaakov agrees he'll work basically for another 6 years. And his reward will be that Lavan will take away any sheep that aren't one color. And then all the sheep that Yaakov will have of Lavan's will only be the one color. And any sheep that are born from that, either spotted, striped, or patched, any one of those, that will be my reward. And they separate with a distance of 3 years. Lavan thinks he's off the wall. He agrees to it. And we read that Yaakov does what the Kabbalists say is a type of tefillin. He takes bark. Now, bark is quite dark. If you take off the outer aspect of the bark, it's white. And that looks like an arm of tefillin. The dark, the white, the dark, the white of the skin. And he has very, very much wealth. After the 6 years, Lavan tried to swindle him, and the angel comes to Yaakov and he says, it's time to get out of here. Yaakov already had too much of a history that every time he spoke to Lavan about leaving, Lavan would swindle him. So he turns to his wives and he says, I'd like to go. And they say, what kind of a father do we have? He even sold us. Of course, let's go. And Yaakov saw the jealousy of the sons of Lavan to him, which would be later in life. Whenever the Jews came into a country, they enriched the country like Spain, but they became wealthy in their own right. There would be terrible jealousy and would cause a lot of anti-Semitism and kicking the Jews out. Now Yaakov is ready to go, and Rachel, Lavan wasn't there. She stole the idols of her father. Seems like she didn't want him to serve idols. Lavan is very upset. He chases them, and Lavan says that night Hashem comes to Lavan in a dream, and he says, "Don't you dare harm Yaakov in any way." When they meet, Lavan is upset. He says, "Why did you run away without me?" And Yaakov said, "You may have taken away from me." And Lavan says, "Why did you steal my gods?" And Yaakov, not knowing that his people did, said, "We never did." And the one who, if there's anyone here who has taken them, they won't live out the year. And that would happen, sadly, to Rachel. He checked everywhere. Rachel was said she was by the way of women, and she got away with it. And then we read how Lavan says, "Habonais benoisai," these women are my daughters, the children are my children, everything is mine. That's the way it was. Anyway, they made a covenant that they won't pass over each other, and we are told that Yaakov calls it Gal Eid, and it says that Lavan kissed his family, and they went on their way. Yaakov holach ledarkoi. At the end of the portion, it says that Yaakov went on his way. He's coming to Israel. Vayifku boy malache elikim, and the angels of God meet him. Unfortunately, although Lavan made a deal that he will not harm Yaakov in any way, he didn't even keep that deal. He sent a message to Eisav that Yaakov is coming back, the one you hated. And that's when Eisav chased him, and that brings us to the next week's portion. Have a good Shabbos. Thank you all for listening. God bless you.